Good afternoon, everybody. I'm George Gann. I'm the Chief Conservation Strategist for the Institute for Regional Conservation. Hello, Janet, and the International Policy Lead for the Society for Ecological Restoration. We're going to talk today about beyond business as usual, transforming our thinking about Pine Rocklands. I'm probably going to talk for a while. I have a lot of material that I'm going to try to cover. And if you have questions or comments, if you can put them in the chat, and hopefully that we will have time at the end to address some of those. The first order of business is to get my screen to go to the next slide, which it's not doing. All right. There we go. All right. So first things first, acknowledgements. Everything that I'm going to cover today is based on the work and help and collaboration of a whole lot of people. So from setting up this presentation and the Pine Rockland Working Group meeting to discussions about the concepts in the presentation, imagery, and funding collaborators. This is a big project that we're all working on together in many different facets, and I know you've heard from a lot of others during this week, and we'll continue to do so. So thanks to everybody. All right, the outline. Jennifer Posley sent us an outline we were supposed to follow. I think I followed the first 3 items on the outline, and then things went in an independent direction. But we're going to talk briefly about my background, IRC's background and mission, our work in Pine Rocklands, the conservation context of the work that we're doing, transformative change, and hopefully some time for conversation. All right. So my background. All right, so my family arrived in South Bay County in 1910. That's my great-grandfather in the upper left and my 2 grandmothers and to the right and in the bottom. So we are a pioneer family settling in the Redland area. And so from my very earliest days, I've heard a lot about Pine Rocklands and the pioneer lifestyle and early agriculture and so forth. And it actually has had quite an influence on me. A number to note at the bottom is in 1910, Miami-Dade County had 11,933 residents. Many of you know my parents, Joyce and Don Gann. My mom recently passed and my dad is still with us. And they had a influence on me and my upbringing and my professional career. And in this slide, they're being honored with the Don and Joyce Gann Day in Miami-Dade County. This is my neighborhood. I didn't make it very far. I was born and raised in South Bay County, and I currently live in Delray Beach. Most of my restoration work has occurred in Florida, but I do floristics work in the Caribbean, including Puerto Rico, the Bahamas, and the Yucatan. And just a note that I started working on Pine Rockland restoration in 1980 in Everglades National Park. And previous to my work with IRC, I also had a design build firm, started doing Pine Rockland restoration in 1986. I work in a space between global and local perspectives on conservation. I'm interested in how to develop global policy that actually works on the ground. And so I do operate at both of those levels, from working with the United Nations and the Convention on Biological Diversity to actually trying to see things get implemented on the ground in Florida. So something that had a huge influence on me and my first introduction to Pine Rocklands was in 1962. I was 1 year old. I'm the kid buried in the sand. Those are my 2 sisters. And you'll note that you can see some pine trees up above the house on the right-hand side of the slide. That property is now a full-blown tropical hammock. And it's been something I've thought quite a lot about over the last few years, about what might have happened if my family had taken a slightly different direction in terms of managing that property. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. All right, so IRC's background and mission. Our mission is to protect, restore, and manage all biodiversity on a regional basis and to prevent the local extinction of native plants, animals, and ecosystems. So we're interested in that whole concept of if we could create a conservation system, including a restoration that would protect all the species and still allow us to live here, what would that look like? So that's a huge ask, but it's something that we want to strive to do as best we can. We've been around for 35 years plus, and we have a staff of 13 associates and 7 board members. We're a small organization with an oversized impact, I'd like to think. We do floristic and faunistic inventories, rare species research, ecological restoration design and implementation, educational training and workshops, online tools and resources, and international policy. So one of the things that IRC tries to do is to provide resources so that people can do better conservation work. And those are, a lot of them are online, like Natives to Your Neighborhood, the Floristic Inventory of South Florida. We have Facebook pages for Puerto Rico and the Yucatan. We've produced Rare Plants of South Florida, the book, which is available online now. And we also do printed guides, such as this, the one in the lower right-hand corner for gardening on the barrier island in South Palm Beach County. We have robust ecological restoration and community outreach programs, and like to think that we try to integrate those as much as possible, because although we do have a small professional crew doing restoration work, it's only through engagement with the public and the community that our projects are really going to be successful in the long term. As I mentioned, we do international policy work, and one of our major accomplishments was to collaborate on the production of the International Principles and Standards for the Practice of Ecological Restoration with the Society for Ecological Restoration, SER Australasia. The second edition came out about a year ago and has already been downloaded more than 10,000 times. All right, so IRC's work in Pine Rocklands. So we've been working in Pine Rocklands for quite a while. IRC's program in South Florida started in the mid-1990s, and we immediately started to do floristic inventories of many Pine Rockland sites. The Naval Observatory site was a project with Florida Natural Areas Inventory, for example. And then we did all kinds of work related to the floristic inventory of South Florida and rare plants of South Florida. And many of the species that we covered in that book are Pine Rockland species. That work, like all of our work, has been very collaborative and included a lot of people. And I just want to mention Steve Woodmansey and Keith Bradley. And we worked together for well over a decade in the early parts of this process. One of the things we were able to do was get a whole bunch of species, almost 80 added to the state list, and many of those were Pine Rockland species. We've also been pretty good about getting media attention to Pine Rocklands over the years. We've done a bunch of very intense projects. This one, 2003 to 2008, we worked on Long Pine Key on species of management concern, and worked on 31 species that were covered in our book. Some of those were hammock species and some of those were Pine Rockland species, but a pretty intense project over a 5-year period. And one of the outcomes of that was the realization that rare plants are actually quite common on Long Pine Key, and it's both in Pine Rocklands and Rockland hammocks, and also in the transitional marl prairies. We continued that work with Everglades National Park in many different facets and produced this report, Rare Plants of Everglades National Park, Vascular Plant Species of Management Concern, where we worked on 60 species over an extended period of time. So here are some of the species of management concern that occur in Pine Rocklands. And so we wrote species of counts on all of those, and their history in Everglades National Park on Long Pine Key, and where they were known from and how many there were and who discovered them and so forth. We also did a large inventory project in in Biscayne National, I'm sorry, in Big Cypress National Preserve. And we did work in the Lost Man Pines area, but also in Pine Rocklands north of Tamiami Trail. So I call this the Woodmansee and Hodges Pine Rockland Cell in Big Cypress, where they found things like Crossopetalum melissifolium and Angadania birderi and so forth. So it's not just on the Miami Rock Ridge. We've also done work in the National Key Deer Refuge and elsewhere. We did a big mapping project in Miami-Dade County of the remaining natural forest communities in Miami-Dade County that included both rockland hammock and pine rocklands. And so that original mapping work flows into a lot of the maps that you see and a lot of the estimates of how much pine rockland remains. And we'll come back to this slide later, but this is Stephen Hodges doing a walk around, doing the actual physical mapping of the pine rockland boundaries. In 2005, we started the Pine Rockland Initiative. So this originally was a program to provide assistance to private owners of pine rocklands, but it's expanded over the years and now involves both private and public properties. Our most recent work has been funded by, in the most part, by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Coastal Program in collaboration with Kevin Callas and others. And it's a great program that we've been working on now for 15 years. Here are some of our current projects scattered around Miami-Dade County, public and private lands at different levels of work. And here are some of our project sites in the National Key Deer Refuge, and this includes both restoration, removal of invasive species, hardwood reduction, mechanical removal of hardwoods using skid steers, and also a project doing augmentation of Croton linearis for Bartram's Scrub Hare Street. We are also proud owners of 2 pine rockland parcels. This one in Goulds, we have another very small one in Florida City. So we know firsthand the work that's required to actually manage these parcels. We produce information that can be used in research and also learning and citizen science and urban gardening, such as producing the list of pine rockland taxa in the Floristic Inventory of South Florida on the left, and also lists of species of pine rockland plants that might be appropriate for small scale restoration and gardening in the urban zone, in native sphere neighborhood on the right. We produce guidance on pine rocklands. So on the left, in 2007, I published this guidelines for planting a pine rockland in South Florida. I've been collaborating with Jennifer Posley and Steve Woodmansee to update this guidance, and hopefully that will go out in the next week or 2 or 3, but it's very close to being finished. So we're looking forward to getting that launched. I was involved in this idea a few years ago of the expanding the pine rockland footprint, and we held a workshop in 2018 with IRC in Miami-Dade County and U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in Fairchild. The idea that we have to move beyond our current situation where we're continuously losing ground and figure out a way to get things going in the positive direction. That workshop in 2018 morphed into a keynote address that I gave at the 2018 Pine Rockland Working Group Conference to get the idea that we have to move from the negative to the positive in dealing with pine rockland restoration and conservation. We've been participating in the Pine Rockland Business Plan concept that will be discussed next week on Friday. But that's an effort to try and consolidate as much information as possible about pine rocklands, their restoration and management needs, and work on prioritizing what it is that we need to do. So we've been participating in that process. And as part of that, I've been leading the ecological restoration sub-team. And one of the things that we're trying to do is to develop metrics so that we can know where we stand now in terms of different ecological attributes in Pine Rocklands and where we want to end up. So we'll talk a lot more about this next week, but this has been a really interesting process in terms of discussing these different metrics and in terms of making decisions about how we can move forward in terms of good restoration. All right. So now we're going to go on to a general, pardon me, a general conservation context conversation, and then we'll drill down into Pine Rocklands. So this is an image of the North American Coastal Plain Global Hotspot. So South Florida was originally part of the Caribbean biodiversity hotspot, and we were kicked out because we didn't have high enough rates of endemism. But now we are included in this new, newish, 2014 now, North American Coastal Plain Global Hotspot. But you can see by the gray that we're a little bit different from most of the coastal plain, which we all know. And it becomes very important in terms of understanding what is at stake here in South Florida. We know that there are temperate species that reach the ends of their ranges in South Florida and tropical species that reach into the United States, continental United States and South Florida. And it's that zone of influence where things are being added and lost between temperate and tropical species as we move from south to north that makes this area particularly floristically interesting. We have a reasonable number of endemics, 110 taxa in South Florida. Many of those are pine rockland plants. We'll talk a little bit more about those later. This Euphorbia conferta is primarily in pine rocklands, but it's also in marl prairies and other areas of limestone outcrops. We also have species that are wide ranging, in some cases species in South Florida that are more common in other parts of the world, like this black rush. For IRC, local biodiversity matters. Sure, we want to make sure that we don't lose global endemics, but we also are interested in making sure that we are able to protect, conserve, and restore the largest number of species at the local level that we possibly can. And this also is true of animals, and in particular species like butterflies that can persist in these fragmented landscapes that we deal with. All right, in terms of protected areas, South Florida has one of the best protected area systems in the world in terms of percent of area. So the current, expiring this year, but the current Convention on Biological Diversity target for protected areas and terrestrial ecosystems is 17%. And we have 50% of South Florida approximately in conservation area. So you'll see some global maps that show South Florida being in a fairly good shape. If you see the 50% for nature maps, South Florida is green, but anybody who works in Pine Rocklands or Flatwoods or anything, any kind of upland terrestrial ecosystems knows that this is actually, we're not in good shape because we have great protection of wetlands and very, very poor protection of upland ecosystems where people live, and therefore biodiversity suffers. All right, so pine rockland loss in this context. We have large-scale clearing occurring about the time that my family arrived. People clearing primarily for agriculture in the beginning, but then also fairly early on, 1922, you have the development of Coral Gables, so massive loss of pine rocklands in the northern part of the Pine Rockland Range for housing developments and other kinds of development. The invention of the rock plow, which is this drawing on the right-hand side, was incredibly important in terms of increasing the speed and ability of converting pine rocklands into agricultural lands. And this is a slide that I showed 2 years ago of the loss of pine rocklands over time. We actually don't have any records really that are available yet from 1900 to 1975. That's unless somebody has recently done some work using aerial photography, but we've interpolated kind of when things might have happened, and that's the lower bit. So the figure of less than 2% seems to be valid, although the measurements of what was counted becomes very important, because in the later measurements, we're really only measuring things that that we decided were pine rocklands, and we'll talk a little bit later about how that might have been a mistake. All right, so here I'm sure that you've seen this map in other presentations during this week, but this is the map of the Miami Rock Ridge outside of Everglades National Park. And the thing I wanted to point out is that each of these areas is unique and different and important, and that every last fragment of pine rocklands is critical in terms of conserving and restoring biodiversity. In terms of unique taxa, you'll see that only 4 species are found only along Pine Key and not elsewhere on the Miami Rock Ridge, but 119 taxa are found on the Miami Rock Ridge outside of Long Pine Key. So there's a whole bunch of species, many of them temperate, but also some tropical species and endemics that are simply not found in Everglades National Park. So anyone who argues that we don't need to protect pine rocklands outside of Everglades National Park is wrong, because there are many, many species that don't exist there, as well as the lower elevation of Everglades National Park puts it at higher risk for sea level rise effects. We're also continuing to experience pine rockland loss. I saw that yesterday the Miami Wilds was approved. So this has just been a long, sad story of continuing loss, and something that we just have to not accept, that's not the right word. We have to acknowledge, but figure out a way to prevent this from continuing. In the lower Florida Keys, kind of a similar kind of process. You have basically development. You have, as a proportion, more pine rocklands are protected in the National Key Deer Refuge and on county land, but still a pretty dismal picture, especially in the southern part of the Big Pine Key pine rocklands. Here are some slides put together by Jim Snyder, and threats to pine rocklands in the Keys include development like on the Miami Rock Ridge, but also improper fire regime and exotic species, which are also true on the Miami Rock Ridge on the mainland, but also sea level rise, which is a huge threat in the Florida Keys. All right, management challenges in pine rocklands. Prescribed fire. There are never enough resources or support, so we are continuously losing ground. In the absence of fire, we have the expansion of native hardwoods and palms, and these shade out the understory where most of the biodiversity is. And this is true also of slash pines. So after Hurricane Andrew, almost all of the slash pines outside of Everglades National Park died, and there was a big effort to replant and direct seed, and that was all very successful, and in many cases too successful, because now it's the pines themselves that are shading out the understory and eliminating many of the rare species that we're concerned about. And thanks to Suzanne Copter, I wanted to just also describe how that this loss of habitat for plants, lower reproductive success, and so forth, is also something that people are working on from the scientific perspective. So there's actual data to show how this operates. We have expanding exotics and also native vines. So there's you know, as in everywhere in South Florida, it's like every month we have a new exotic species that's blowing up, or that we're becoming aware of, and so that's a continuing issue. And species loss. So this is a slide of some species that have been probably lost from pine rocklands, but were recorded for pine rocklands at some period in time. And so we know that just the process of fragmentation, we lose species just from habitat loss, but also the process of fragmentation leads to the loss of species within any individual parcel. The smaller it is, the more loss there is over time, unless some other kind of corrective action is taken. All right, so we want to talk a little bit about transformative change and what does that mean in general, and what does it mean for Pine Rocklands? So this issue of transformative change at the global level is really being pushed by the IPBES that produced this report that globally more than 1 million species are threatened with extinction. And if we don't do something fundamentally different, then that is not going to stop. So there's a lot of conversation at the global level about this transformative change and what does it mean. And I don't have the full answer, but it's definitely not business as usual. So here's another slide about that, and the idea of incremental change or adaptive solutions versus steep, long, systemic changes. And so I think that as a community and people interested in the conservation and restoration of pine rocklands, that we have to think about what are we doing that is incremental, that maybe helps a little bit, and what is it that we really need? How do we really shake things up so that we can change the trajectory from one of long, slow, painful, continuous loss to a process that is restorative, that actually leads to success in the long term? And I want to draw your attention to this slide on the restorative continuum. So this is in the Society for Ecological Restoration International Standards. And what we try to do is describe very clearly what is ecological restoration and how that is, unlike other kinds of restorative activities, based on a native reference ecosystem as a model. And we want as much of that as we possibly can. So when we're dealing with pine rocklands, we want to restore every parcel, every bit, as much as we possibly can. But there are all kinds of other activities that people can participate in that can help push things in the right direction, that are indeed restorative. And so we want to identify what those are, and in this context, how all of these incremental things that people are doing can help move things in the right direction to actually increase the potential over the long term of doing restoration of pine rocklands and achieving full recovery in as many places as we can. So part of this idea of transformative change is that we have to aspire to more. We have to come up with ideas like expanding the footprint, not rear guard actions of please don't destroy this last piece, which we are losing that battle. So we have to turn that around, and we have to say, how can we actually increase the area of pine rocklands, increase the integrity and quality of these ecosystems? And ideas like the Pine Rockland Business Plan that help us organize our thoughts about that. And the more that we can get organized and think about what our aspiration needs to be, that it needs to be more. It needs to be net gain, not no net loss. No net loss is not going to work. We have to have net gain of ecosystem area and quality in the long haul if we are going to be successful in protecting this community for the future. We know in this process that we cannot fix everything. Sea level rise is just a reality that we're going to have to deal with, and we're going to have some losses. So we need to understand what that means, and where is that going to take place, and then how we can take other actions elsewhere to give this ecosystem the best possible outcome that we can. So some of this material I've covered before. I've reorganized it a little bit today into a list of 10 things for us to think about. And so I'm just going to present those, and then hopefully we'll have a bit of time for conversation. I think we will. The first thing is this idea of rethinking what is a pine rockland. So in this slide, where is the pine rockland? Is it behind Stephen Hodges? Is it that pine forest in the back where you can see the pine trees coming up after a very hot fire? Is it the area on the right-hand side of the slide where you have Brazilian pepper that's coming in, and there might even be less than 50% cover pine rockland species? Or is it the area on the left-hand side of the slide to Hodges' right, this mode area where it's been scraped, and yet you can see that there's a lot of pine rockland understory plants there. And so in this process of mapping, I can tell you for sure that the area behind in the back was mapped as a pine rockland. The area to the right with the Brazilian pepper may or may not have been, depending on the cover of exotics and the amount of disturbance. Love the tires. But the area on the left-hand side of the slide that's mowed would not have been mapped as pine rockland. And although from a bureaucratic or a legal perspective that might have made sense, from a conservation standpoint it does not, because that area that is mowed is very likely had a very high number of pine rockland species on it, and we should treat it as a restoration opportunity rather than something that is just not a pine rockland, or a lost pine rockland, or a destroyed pine rockland. So consistent with this thinking, Jennifer Posley in 2015 published this in the Fairchild magazine about this idea of disturbed pine rocklands, including areas that had been cleared and had been mowed, and fire excluded pine rocklands were both very important in terms of conserving this ecosystem and restoring it. And that was great. I'm glad she did that. And so we've, it really helped to set the stage for people to think about this more. And one of the things that we realize is that pine rocklands are actually pretty resilient. So for decades, for a long period of time, we treated pine rocklands with kid gloves. We just basically tried to keep the invasive weeds out and get fire on the ground if we could. We tended to ignore sites like this that had pine rockland understory. And we can't do that anymore. And so actually when we started investigating, we started looking a lot more, we see that there are all kinds of pine rockland plants in places like this, and that it's actually a fairly resilient ecosystem. And some of the places that we think of as being intact pine rocklands, in fact, are not, that they were cleared long ago and have recovered. Number two, protect all intact and restorable pine rocklands. So we need to identify, we need to map where are all these places that still have pine rockland understory plants growing on them, that have limestone substrate where we could do restoration. We need to identify where those are all. We need to find mechanisms to get the last remaining tracts of intact pine rockland into protection, whether it's on private land or public land, does not matter, but find some way of stopping this continuous loss. We're near the end. Almost everything has been acquired, but we need to finish the job and protect in some way or another all of the intact parcels. Okay, another important point is don't fragment, defragment. All right, and apparently the Miami County Commissioners didn't get that, or maybe that wasn't, that argument wasn't used strongly enough, but fragmentation is bad for nature. Fragmentation leads to degradation. The more fragmentation, the worse it is for the ecosystems that we're trying to protect. The more that we can defragment, actually do restoration in these parcels that can increase connectivity, that can reduce weed loads and so forth, that can increase the probability that we can do prescribed burning and so forth. All of these things are good. So anything that defragments pine rocklands is great, and anything that leads to more fragmentation or isolation is bad. So I was quoted in the Miami Herald a few weeks ago, and I think this is a point that I think we need to really make, that from a policy perspective, even places like parking lots under pavement or these mowed areas that we cannot, from a policy perspective, say that's gone, that's destroyed. That's not helpful thinking. What's helpful thinking is to say that it's a pine rockland with asphalt over the top of it, or it's a mowed pine rockland that needs restoration. This is a shift in our thinking and the way we communicate about this, because this idea that we overemphasize pristine nature or intact nature is a disadvantage for us politically. It does not help our case. What we need to be focusing on is the function that these places can play and the restoration potential, because only by doing that, by restoring these places, defragmenting, can we stop things like Miami wilds. So it's our own way that we communicate, in my opinion, that hurts this process. So this is number 4, burn wherever and whenever possible. And there's all kinds of examples that we can do burning. And thanks to the Glancies for these 2 slides, they've been burning next to their house for decades. And so we really need to be very aggressive about trying to get fire on the ground safely, which, there's a large body of management and science knowledge behind that. So let's use that, but it's going to take some PR. It's going to take some changes in the way that we organize ourselves and so forth. Thanks to Suzanne Copter for the video of the burn at the FIU Preserve. And, I think this is so cool. The idea that you can actually do these kinds of burns in these urban areas is right next to the Florida Turnpike. Again, it's evidence that we can do this stuff. And so we need to get these kinds of examples and not be happy when they happen every few decades, but figure out a way to make them happen frequently so that the smoke levels are lower and the safety is higher and so forth. And also, to give credit where it's due, Miami-Dade County, NAM, and EEL have been, with the collaborating municipalities, really raising the bar and getting out there and getting these burns done in the urban area. And so this burn at Ned Glen, Pine Shore, and others is incredibly important. When we started doing the restoration work at Ned Glen a few years ago, the conversation was, this is never going to burn. It's right next to a school. It's right next to a playground. It's in the middle of Cutler Bay. And that's just not going to happen. And just because of a change in thinking inside Miami-Dade County, that did change. We were able to do some hardwood reduction in collaboration with the county. The county was able to burn, and that's amazing. And we need to celebrate that. Number 5, support both public and private conservation efforts. So we need to get the public conservation efforts properly funded, which we all know they are not. We need to find a way to get that done, but we also need to understand the role of private conservation. The fact of the matter is that whatever tax benefit that private owners get is far exceeded by the amount of effort and time and money that goes in to the stewardship of their land. So anything that we can do to provide support for private conservation efforts needs to be done. We need to document the potential for natural recovery. So one of the things that was kind of right in front of our face for a long period of time, when we were all thinking Pine Rocklands are just very fragile, and once you bulldoze them, they're gone forever and so forth. But there was evidence right in front of our faces that was not true. And one of those things is the fire breaks at Everglades National Park. So those areas were bulldozed long ago. They're mowed. People drive over them, and they're chock full of rare plants, including things that are found nowhere else. So we had this evidence that, in fact, these things were not as fragile as we thought. And so let's find all of that evidence. We're also finding evidence at places like Sock South, which is a former scrape site that had buildings on it and roads and parking lots that, in fact, given the right processes, that these native species can, in fact, recover. We want to look to examples like the Hole in the Donut restoration at Everglades National Park. Although the money for that project comes from wetlands mitigation, the Pine Rocklands were fingers that went into the Hole in the Donut, and in certain areas, the Pine Rockland is coming back following the restoration of these farm fields. And we can use that kind of information to help us think about how we can do restoration of farm fields outside of Everglades National Park. So let's look at all of the evidence that is available to us to think about this problem. Number 7, we want to identify all restoration opportunities. So we want to figure out where these things are, where are these opportunities in terms of restoring the extent and the quality of Pine Rocklands everywhere that is possible. So in thinking about this, this is right next to IRC's preserve in Florida City. and the owner, boy, it was full of Brazilian pepper and bulldozed it. We think the intent was to bulldoze it for somebody to build a house, but um, the issue is that is that destroyed, or is that just an opportunity for restoration? So maybe this person unwittingly, they thought they were destroying it. Well, let's get rid of nature. Let's bulldoze it. But actually, they may have put it on a course that would make it easier to restore than it was before. Can we take advantage of those kinds of things? And these opportunities are all over the place. So at the Richmond Pine Rocklands, the Coast Guard Station, at the National Key Deer Refuge, some of the higher quality places are these former scrape sites. Let's look for all of those opportunities to do restoration, to take advantage of the natural recovery that is taking place and push it further in the right direction. The whole idea of fire suppression and the so-called transitional pinelands, the idea that pinelands naturally succeed into hammocks and so forth, has really been unhelpful thinking. That whenever we have these pine rocklands that are overtaken by hardwoods, we need to be able to go in, think about going in and logging, cutting the hardwoods out so that we can get the ecosystem moving in the right direction. I'm sorry to say this, but we're going to see even more push for tree planting, and that means hardwood trees. It's a global process. We now have a 1 trillion tree project and so forth. And in savannas and grassland ecosystems, dicot trees are not good. They're not helpful. And so we need to change people's perception about this, that we shouldn't accept hardwood invasion in pine rocklands, that we should go in and do what is necessary to move things in the right direction. And this includes other degraded sites on the edges of conservation areas and so forth, where we have former rock plowed soils or completely blasted areas that are nothing but an exotic thicket. We shouldn't be shy about saying, okay, we need the resources to go in there and do that restoration. Do we need to work on the techniques, how that is going to happen? Sure we do. Let's not say that's a lost cause. Number 8, we need to support restoration in the urban zone. Connect to Protect has been doing a fabulous job there. And we also have resources with Natives for Your Neighborhood. But this is important for several reasons. One, we need to have higher connectivity between these fragments in the urban and suburban areas. We can also learn a lot. We can learn a lot by having hundreds or thousands of people doing small projects. We can learn about restoration. We can learn about connectivity and the different species and so forth. But probably the most important is this idea of getting the public to understand what it is that we're trying to do. So getting people in the urban zone to plant pine trees and having their neighbors say, what is that? And making sure that they are beautiful and functional is super important, because if they're not, it's not helping. But we need to support this work because we need to engage the public. Without the public support, we will not make this happen. Okay, we need to not be afraid to try new tools and techniques. Again, for a long time, it was very kids' gloves, and it's time to take the gloves off. Sure. Does that need to be done with care and forethought and monitoring and so forth? Absolutely. But we need to be able to experiment, and some sites that are highly degraded are great sites to experiment on or to do trials on. So we've used the skid steer down on Big Pine Key and on No Name Key, and we said, well, let's try that in Miami-Dade County. So we use that at Sauk South with great results. Where we can't burn or we have high loads of weeds that would never burn anyway, can we use brush cutters to try and move things in the right direction? And we're having great results. Here's a slide of some Galactia smalleyi. The one on the left were remnant plants underneath Brazilian pepper after it was, if it was chopped up by the skid steer, just exploded. And then on the right, we have actual recruitment in these areas that were just invasive species thickets. We're also doing mowing in areas with more than 50% native cover, where we cannot use fire because we're too close to the airstrip at Homestead Air Reserve Base. So we're just starting this now, and one of our was that we're not seeing all the plants when the grass thatch is cut back. And so in one case, we had recorded 0 plants of Linum arenicola prior to mowing because we could not see them and they were underneath the thatch or they were suppressed. And after the 6 weeks, just in 6 weeks, from 0 to 11 plants in a 2.5 meter radius plot. We're also having great success with hardwood reduction in National Key Deer Refuge. This area was exploding with Plukia and Solanum and other early successional species after the wildfire. And we've gone in and done a bunch of work there. And the understory recovery in areas that people thought were too far gone, they were just too many hardwoods. There was no way that we could restore those. They are in fact full of pine rockland plants. And now a more regular fire system could be put into place there. We've been working on saw palmetto reduction. This is at Pine Shore. One of the things that happens in the absence of regular fire, Pine Shore is great. There's very few hardwoods, very few invasive weeds, but the saw palmettos are slowly increasing their cover over time at the expense of the grassy and wildflower understory, including Polygola smallii. Can we cut those back and increase the grassy and forb understory? And we can. And then Jennifer Posley showed this picture on Monday, the sable palm removal at AD Barnes, and we're really happy to see that happening, where fire suppression and other kinds of disturbances leading to increased palm cover. We must try these methods to figure out how to get things moving back in the right direction. Pine thinning, I showed a slide earlier of the pine, the overabundance of pines at Florida City, and this is a pine thinning project we're doing at Florida City, a trial. Again, we're trying to get close to the amount of pine numbers that current guidance is thinking that we need, and the understory recovery there has also been great. Jennifer also talked about other kinds of tools and thinking, and we also just need to continue to improve our methods about normal, regular stuff, like what herbicides to use and what methods to use and so forth. And so this idea of spraying Nairaudia after it's been cut instead of waiting for it to resprout has been hugely helpful. We've been employing this. It takes far less time. If you have a single sprig sticking up somewhere, you don't lose it, and so forth. So just these kinds of simple improvements are incredibly helpful. Direct seeding, something we thought we could never do. Fairchild and colleagues started some trials with direct seeding at Nixon Smiley. We've been doing some at Sock South. Ours are a little bit different. We're trying these islands of grasses to see if we can use mowing in the weedy areas, but get grass patches starting, and we're having great success with that. This idea of planting shrubs and pines and coonties and palms in islands so that we can use mowing as a management technique for these weedy areas is something we're also employing there. Interestingly, this particular site had no saw palmettos left. They'd all been scraped away, so this is a species that we needed to reintroduce. So at the end of the day, number 10, develop measurable targets and document success. So we need to have an idea of what is it we're shooting for, and we're working very hard, many of us, on deciding what those targets should be, at least from a preliminary standpoint, so that we can measure our progress at these sites. And then this is just an example of some work at Sock South where we use the forestry, the skid steer and the forestry mulcher, and other kinds of techniques. And what we're finding is that in a very short period of time, we can actually get things moving in the right direction. All right, a couple of closing thoughts. This is not about Pine Rocklands. This is about conservation and restoration. We got to play the long game. This is something that we really have to stay focused on the future of our planet, and for our kids and our grandkids and so forth, that we really need to have a long focus. I've talked a lot about the science part of this, but there's all kinds of social issues and education and so forth. This is about a coastal upland thing, but can we teach can we teach second graders, 7 and 8 year olds about degradation and restoration? Can they visualize that? And they can. And so we need to continue to do whatever we can in those areas. I know many of you are doing that work, and thank you for doing that. That's not my area of expertise, but just to acknowledge that all of these social and educational components of this work is critical. At the end of the day, this is the choice: business as usual, slow, gradual, painful loss, or the idea that we can actually create a restorative concept for Pine Rocklands, that we can increase the footprint, increase the area of Pine Rocklands and the integrity and quality, and move things in a completely different direction. Thank you very much, and to all of our collaborators, sponsors, and supporters. Okay, so we have a few minutes, not as many as I wanted, but we do have a little bit of time. So Michelle, are you able to read me some questions? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing here just so that I don't forget to do that.
So if anyone has any questions, feel free to write them in the Zoom group chat, and I can read them out to George. I know earlier we had a question from Luis Moreno. Earlier he asked, how can NGOs and private citizens raise awareness and set in motion government action and for environmental code revisions, like Miami-Dade County, to tackle inconsistencies, loopholes, and lack of coordination in outdated tree and landscape ordinances and zoning codes, agency policies, etc.? Numerous undesignated remnant Pine Rockland sites are not afforded regulatory protection because these codes and policies do not recognize upland natural habitats and native plant communities worthy of preservation, mitigation, and developmental restriction.
Well, it sounds like Luis knows more about this than I do. And I would like to say that the issue of figuring out how to get the regulatory environment in a better place is one that many people are working on. It's not my area of expertise, other than to say that we need to get that done. What we do know is that the current situation doesn't work. I feel like that the future really is going to rest on acquiring and protecting the remnants that remain, that we're not being successful in terms of stopping development from occurring in these parcels. Anything that could be done to prevent things like the sale of Richmond Pine Rocklands needs to be thought about carefully. And then I think most of the future is going to rest on incentives. It's going to rest on providing mechanisms that make sure that that EEL has the funding and NAM has the funding that they need, that private owners of Pine Rocklands have incentives to do the work that they need, that the technology exists, the information is shared, and so forth. So I believe that we're passing from one kind of a regulatory environment to another. Even with on the federal level, with animals that have higher degree of protection, our success is not so good. There are others here that I can see on my screen that could answer this much more effectively than me, but this is kind of like a big picture response.
Thank you. There's a question from Tiffany. Is the Miami Rock Ridge shapefile available anywhere online?
That sounds like something for people in the chat to answer.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, Durham has information. The Pine Rockland business plan has a product that we're working on. There's various ways of getting the GIS information. So who should well, let's say yes, but I don't have it.
Okay. Oh, here's a question. What effect do you think mulching after mowing, chopping has on fuel loads and future prescribed fires? Do you think there is a better solution, removing debris or selective mulching?
So one of the things that so we know this is true, and there's a lot of chopping that's been done in other flatwoods. People are moving away from roller chopping and toward, you know, this kind of mowing forestry cutter machines. And my initial thinking was that it just simply wasn't going to work. You're going to produce a whole bunch of mulch, and that's going to be bad because it's going to increase the nutrient loads in the soil. And that is true when it's really heavy. But what we've been really surprised about is that when the mulch loads have been a little bit lower, the decomposition rate and the oxidation of that organic material has proceeded very rapidly. So in terms of future fire, what we have to have are grasses. We have to have, you know, flammable things on the ground and not weed patches, because fire is not going to burn through Bidens. So can we find ways of using these cutting machines to get things moving in the right direction? And I think that we can. One of the things that we've learned is that it doesn't necessarily do any good, say, to chop things up or rip things up and leave bare soil. So the weed load in Miami-Dade County on the Miami Rock Ridge is so high that that you just end up with fields of weeds. So the idea of, can we move things from weeds, you know, from Brazilian pepper thickets to Pine Rockland vegetation without turning everything into fields of weeds? And this is kind of the idea behind these direct seeding trials. Can we create these patches of native vegetation so that we can just use regular mowing machines to mow the weeds while we're getting the native ground cover established, and then connecting those ground cover patches? And in terms of what we've learned to date, I think that there's a very good possibility of this working. That one small patch, we did that meter square, and there were many of them across the site, you know, but that one patch is growing very quickly, and the grasses are moving out along on the, you know, so 1 meter ends up being 3 meters and so forth. And how do we connect the dots? And there's also some thinking about say timing of mowing. So if we have to mow, if we're going to end up with fields of Bidens in between these patches of native grasses, can we say mow when the grasses are in seed? And can we help use the actual mowers to move the native seeds into these intervening areas? And at first glance, it looks like, yes, that actually can work. What we're finding is that the native grasses and understory ground covers are actually actively moving into areas that were dominated by things like chromalina and Bidens and so forth. So these are still trials, and at some point the science community needs to pick up some actual studies that can be replicated and so forth. But at first glance, it seems like we can use these machines to get things going in the right direction. And it is now 1 o'clock. So thanks everybody for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed it. And look, I appreciate seeing so many friends and colleagues online. So thanks a lot. Time to sign off. Bye-bye.